Right, let me tell you something that's been eating away at me for weeks now, and I'm not going to dance around it like some trembling palace courtier afraid of offending the wrong person. What happened behind those ancient Windsor Castle walls last month was nothing short of extraordinary, and the fact that we're only now beginning to understand the gravity of it should tell you everything you need to know about how this family operates when the chips are truly down. I've spent decades covering the royals, and I thought I'd seen everything. The scandals, the divorces, the interviews that shook the monarchy to its core. But what I'm about to walk you through is different. This isn't about tabloid fodder or family squabbles played out in public. This is about a moment when the entire institution had to look in the mirror and decide what kind of monarchy it wanted to be going forward. It started with a message that went out in the early hours of a morning that nobody inside the palace will ever forget. Not a press release, not a carefully worded statement drafted by some communications team earning six figures to make everything sound palatable. No, this was a direct order. Get to Windsor now. And when that kind of instruction comes through, channels that are only used when the whole house of cards is about to collapse, you know, something seismic is unfolding. The people who received that message understood immediately. They didn't need explanations or context. The very fact that they were being summoned told them everything. And so they came separately, quietly, without the usual pomp and circumstance that follows these people everywhere they go. No photographers stationed outside, no advance warning to the press. This was happening in the shadows because what they were about to discuss couldn't be allowed to leak until they'd made a decision about how to handle it. Princess Anne arrived first, and let me tell you something about Anne. She's the one member of that family I've always had time for. No nonsense, no pretense, just gets on with the job without moaning about it or giving interviews about how hard her life is. She walked into that meeting room carrying nothing, asking for nothing, because she already knew what was coming. She'd been preparing for this conversation, whether she realized it or not, for years. Then came Charles. Now, I've had my issues with Charles over the years. Everyone knows that. But what I saw in the reports from people who were there that morning was a man who looked genuinely exhausted. Not tired from a bad night's sleep, but worn down by the weight of information he'd been processing for hours. He sat down at that table without any of the usual formality, without the rituals that normally accompany a king entering a room, because this wasn't about rank. This was about survival. William came last, and here's where it gets really interesting. He didn't bring staff, didn't bring advisors, didn't bring the usual entourage that follows an heir to the throne. He came alone because what was about to be discussed wasn't just about the present, it was about his future. Everything that was decided in that room would directly impact how quickly he'd have to step up, how soon he'd have to shoulder responsibilities he thought he'd have more time to prepare for. And here's what strikes me most about all of this. What didn't happen? There were no lawyers hovering by the door. No communications experts ready to spin whatever came out of that meeting. No aides positioned to soften the blow or find some middle ground that would keep everyone comfortable. They'd stripped the room bare of everyone who might try to manage the message, because this wasn't about message management anymore. This was about truth. For a moment, nobody said anything. And in that silence, you could feel the weight of what they all understood. The old playbook, the one they'd relied on for generations, the delay and deflect and carefully manage the narrative approach, that was finished. They'd run out of road. The question wasn't whether they were going to speak. It was how badly distorted the truth would become if they didn't take control of it themselves. Charles finally broke the silence with a question that should terrify anyone who understands how this family has operated for centuries. He asked whether silence was still an option. Not whether it was the right choice, not whether it was preferable, but whether it was even possible anymore without causing irreparable damage. And the answer was written on every face in that room. Before anyone spoke, the time for silence had passed. Anne responded first, and she didn't mince words. She told them plainly that staying quiet had already begun to destroy them. What they'd convinced themselves was discretion had become something far worse, a misrepresentation through inaction. The monarchy, she said, was now at risk not because of the circumstances themselves, but because they'd held those circumstances apart from public understanding for too long. William sat there absorbing every word, and you could see him processing what this meant for him personally. He wasn't there as some junior member being briefed. He was there because his entire trajectory was about to accelerate in ways that no amount of training could prepare him for. The future wasn't some distant concept anymore. It was pressing against the present, demanding to be acknowledged. As they went through the details, the reality became undeniable. This wasn't something that would blow over. It wasn't a situation that would resolve itself if they just gave it time and space. The implications reach far beyond family concern into the very structure of how the monarchy functions, how responsibility transfers, how continuity is maintained when the ground beneath you shifts, and focused on the risk with the kind of directness that makes palace officials nervous. She reminded them that history doesn't judge institutions for facing tragedy, it judges them for running from it. In moments like this, she insisted, credibility isn't preserved by playing it safe, it's preserved by having the courage to be clear. Nobody argued. The usual instinct to delay, to wait for more information, to see if things might improve on their own, that had been exhausted. They all understood they'd reached the end of what evasion could accomplish. Now they had to decide who they were going to be when the truth finally came out, because it was coming out one way or another. The only question left was whether they'd control that narrative or let it control them. And that's when every eye in the room turned to Anne. So Anne took her time before speaking, and that pause said more than most people realize. This wasn't hesitation, this was calculation. She was letting the room settle, letting everyone understand that what came next would be irreversible. And when she finally opened her mouth, she didn't waste time with pleasantries or summaries of what they'd already discussed. She got straight to the point in a way that would make most PR professionals break out in a cold sweat. The family, she told them bluntly, had exhausted every possible way to manage this situation. Whatever it had been at the start, it had now crossed into territory where spin and strategy were not just useless, they were offensive. This was moral ground now, and moral ground doesn't respond to clever positioning or carefully timed announcement. You either tell the truth or you don't, and if you don't, you live with the consequences of that choice forever. Now let me be clear about something. Anne's authority in that room wasn't based on her being loud or aggressive or pulling rank. It was based on decades of showing up, doing the work, and never asking for special treatment. When she speaks, people listen, not because they're afraid of her, but because they know she only speaks when the situation has become critical. And she laid out their options with surgical precision. They could speak with accuracy and restraint, or they could let the truth dribble out through fragments and rumours shaped by people who had less information and far fewer scruples. There was no third option, no middle ground where they could sort of tell the truth while leaving room to backtrack later. Time, she emphasised, was actively working against them now. Every hour they stayed silent was another hour of credibility draining away. Charles sat there listening, and what struck me about the accounts I've heard is that he didn't push back. Earlier in his reign, he'd been the king who wanted to weigh everything against precedent, who preferred incremental steps to bold moves. But he understood now that there were no incremental steps left to take. They'd reached the cliff edge. Then Anne turned to William, and this is where it gets really heavy. She spoke to him not as a senior royal addressing a junior one, but as someone who understood that his entire future was about to be shaped by what happened in the next few hours. The institution can survive loss, she told him. What it cannot survive is the impression that it dodges truth when truth becomes inconvenient. That stain lingers for generations. This changed everything in the room. They stopped talking about how to minimize damage and started talking about how to maintain integrity. And Anne made it brutally clear what the public statement would have to include. It could not minimize the reality. It could not suggest that outcomes were still uncertain when they weren't. And it absolutely could not imply that they were still deliberating if they'd already reached a conclusion. Any of those approaches would be misdirection, whether they intended it that way or not. Her clarity cut through the last remaining instinct to protect themselves through vagueness. She reframed the whole exercise. This wasn't about exposure, it was about stewardship. The monarchy had never survived by pretending to be untouched by difficulty. It survived by proving it could face difficulty without lying about it. You could feel the unease even though nobody voiced it directly. Because once you say something plainly, you can't take it back. You can't reframe it later when the polls come in or when public reaction isn't what you hoped, and acknowledge that fear without giving into it. She reminded them that what they were so afraid of making permanent already was permanent. The events had occurred, the situation existed. The only choice was whether they'd acknowledge it with integrity or calculation. And history had a long memory for institutions that chose the latter. When the conversation turned to who should actually deliver this message, Anne didn't immediately volunteer. She let the question sit there, and in that space, the answer became obvious to everyone. Her credibility in crisis was recognized not just within the family, but by the public. She wasn't seen as sentimental, she wasn't seen as self-protective, and in this moment, that distinction was everything. When she agreed to do it, she set conditions. The statement would be factual and contained. No speculation, no gestures toward future updates that might give false hope, no emotional theatrics. Tragedy didn't need embellishment to be understood. William nodded once, and that single nod carried the weight of complete acceptance. This wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about preventing further harm through dishonesty. The meeting ended without fanfare. No one tried to lighten the mood or offer reassurance that everything would work out. The path forward had been decided. Anne would speak, the family would stand behind her words without qualification, and whatever happened next would happen without them trying to revise or soften the message afterward. Now, here's what really matters about all of this. The confirmation they were dealing with wasn't a sudden shock. It was the end point of something that had been unfolding for months behind closed doors. Medical assessments that once left room for optimism had converged into certainty. What remained uncertain wasn't the outcome anymore, just how long it would take to arrive. And even that window had narrowed to the point where pretending otherwise would have been obscene. Anne insisted they review the entire timeline from the beginning, not because she didn't know it, but because she wanted absolute clarity before they spoke publicly. Every word would be measured against what they knew privately, and she wasn't going to leave room for someone to accuse them of misleading anyone, even accidentally. As they went through it chronologically, you could see the earlier decisions in a new light. Moments that had felt like prudent caution now looked like postponement. Hope had been doing work it was never equipped to handle. And the person at the center of all this wasn't just a family member. This was someone whose role was central to how the monarchy functions, how it projects continuity, how it maintains its psychological hold on the nation. William absorbed this in complete silence. He'd known things were serious, but having it laid out this starkly removed any remaining buffer between him and a future he wasn't quite ready for. The distance between his personal life and his public duty had just collapsed, and there was no going back. Charles spoke quietly, acknowledging that earlier choices had been made with good intentions. They genuinely believed that discretion served compassion, that protecting privacy was the right thing to do. What he recognized now, and you could hear the difficulty in accepting this, was that discretion had curdled into something else entirely. Anne didn't criticize him for it. She simply reframed it. Discretion had become distortion. The longer truth stayed hidden, the more damaging its eventual emergence would be. They weren't protecting anyone by waiting. They were making it worse. And that realization, that moment when everyone in the room understood they'd been causing harm by trying to prevent it, that was the emotional turning point. This wasn't an assessment anymore. It was an acknowledgement that tragedy had arrived and wouldn't wait for them